Lithium is being extracted mainly from brines in, say, like Chile and Argentina, but it's very water intensive. They're essentially pulling the water out in the desert and just putting it in these tailing ponds and letting it evaporate. But this
Ah,
is a problem that they're losing that water,
yep.
right? Because you get it, they just let it evaporate. And this is what they're doing right now in northern Argentina and in northern Chile. This is the traditional way of doing lithium now. The idea, though, with this, the technology I talked before, is that water can be re-injected back into the reservoirs, right? Much more sustainable given the fact that, as we know, like water is becoming a scarce commodity. We've taken it for granted for so long. And with changing weather patterns and aspects, right, that it's just becoming more scarce. So we need to
Yeah.
treat it as a scarce item and price it accordingly.
Welcome to another episode of Liquid Assets, where we talk about the intersection between policy, technology, and management, all within the lens of water. Today we have Professor Shon Hiatt.
Hello, I'm Professor Shon Hiatt at the USC Marshall School of Business. I'm an energy and agribusiness strategist, focusing on how firms can gain a competitive advantage and what entrepreneurs can do to exploit and discover new opportunities in these spaces.
I won't take the mic anymore from you, Shon. If you can go ahead and just kind of quickly introduce yourself. What are you working on?
Thank you, Ravi, and thank you for inviting me to this podcast. I do research looking at particularly how companies in energy and agribusiness, what are the actions that they could take that can give them a strategic competitive advantage, particularly as the environment changes and also policies. And, a big issue, of course, today affecting both the agribusiness and energy is this push towards, government policy, what they call this energy transition, which essentially is a much lower kind of carbon economy for energy, right? And there's implications for both the issues of agribusiness and energy, but water plays a big role in this. So I think it's something worth exploring.
Yeah, entirely. And let's kind of unpack a little bit about what you just said, right? You're focusing on government policy on the lower carbon economy. Can you kind of unpack a little bit of that really quick? Like what policies are we seeing today? And when you say lower carbon economy, what is that moving from and what's it moving to? What are kind of just some examples
Yeah.
here?
Well, so let's just take California, for example, because they've been moving quite quickly. In fact, in my opinion, too quickly, and to try to get off of like petroleum and hydrocarbon based type of energy. So, like natural gas, gasoline, diesel, right? I mean, not much coal. There's LEDWP does have a coal plant in Utah, but most most that nobody uses actually coal to produce electricity in the state of California. And so what this means is like, well, what are we going to replace it with? Okay, because the nice thing about having these hydrocarbon types energy generation is they're base load, meaning that we can have them on, and they're deployable. We can have them whenever we want them. Okay, so when there's a need, we turn them on. And one of the issues with pushing towards, again, the choice is like, well, if we want to go towards a lower carbon, where are we going to go? There are many choices out there. There's wind, there's solar, which are intermittent renewables. There's more base load type of renewables, such as geothermal and reservoir hydro. And there's nuclear, right? These are the existing technologies we have right now. And of course, what you want is to create a nice portfolio that balances all of it and keeps one affordability, making it still
Hmm.
reliability, right, is another aspect that needs to have. We want to keep the light. We want the power when we turn on our lights, right? And I feel like in the state of California, of course, they've moved so quickly and they put all their bets into the solar and wind, which is a very difficult situation to be in because it's intermittent, which means you got to invest 5 times the amount of capital generation to get the amount of electrons that you need to run an economy. That's expensive. And that's what we're seeing. Our rates are just been going up and they're going to continue to go up until I think the policymakers here in the state of California allow the policy and allow the generators, electricity generators, to maybe explore other options beyond just wind and solar.
Entirely. And I think you raise a really interesting distinction between intermittent and baseline, right? You were saying, obviously, just kind of re-summarizing this, right? The hydrocarbon based energy, you can flip a switch on and off, right? And that is baseline. You mentioned geothermal and nuclear being kind of other potential baseline technologies, and then obviously the solar and wind being intermittent. If you have these peaks and valleys on the solar and wind side, if you had a magic wand and you could wave to the policy guys in California, what would your portfolio look like? Like, how do we decrease that cost and make sure that we do get to a lower carbon economy a lot more efficiently? What is that?
Well, I guess, this is one of the questions. Like I was asked the other day by a reporter, like, what states are doing it really well? And I said, well, let's just look at three states. And I said, let's look at Texas on one hand, which is completely deregulated. California, which has sort of like a competitive based market, but is really regulated in terms of where the policy is trying to push the future of generation. And then I said, let's look at Utah, right? Which is still a regulated state, but they're very open to all new technologies as long as it remains reliable and affordable, right? So those are the two key things that that policy wants there. And as we talked about and compared it, I said, we look at the decarbonization, if this is like a metric you care about, right? But maintaining affordability and reliability, Utah's doing a pretty good job at that because they're open to the experimentation of all the utilities and independent power generators as long as they keep the lights on and as long as the rates stay affordable, right? In Texas, one of the issues they've been struggling with as being a deregulated market is that they can't compete with the federal incentives for wind, right? This is the biggest issue, not so much the solar, but it's the wind investment. So they've got now up to 30% can be generated from wind at any time for their grid. But when they have the large heat domes where they really need the power for air conditioning, right? That's when the wind stops blowing. And then
Sure.
you're like, well, what do you do? And the same thing happens in the wintertime. When it gets very cold, the wind stops blowing. And then this becomes problematic for them because they have to have like essentially what we call gas peakers on the side, emergency generators to go up. But if you invest too much, this is the issue with it, as we think about it, whenever we make investments, capital investments in energy, we
Mhm.
have to think about what is the entire, capital cost spread over the lifetime of that generation facility and its use. So what is it's like? Is it going to be used 85% of the time, like a typical plant, 90% of the time? Or is it only going to use 5% of the time, 5 to 10% of the time? That means the rates you have to charge when you're using for the peak have to be extravagant, right? So that's what happens is if we're relying too much on the wind or like the solar intermittent, and to pick it up, we have these gas peakers, which are great because we can keep the lights on. But the amount of energy we're going to be paying for that intermittent energy, or when it goes down from like the peak generation, is going to be very expensive, and that's really what's been driving this up. The same thing they said, well, let's just go to the batteries. Batteries are, I mean, that's another option for those 4-hour gaps,
Mhm.
but that's also very expensive. So you can see then why rates go up the more you add more intermittent energy sources. It's because the power required that you have to buy for those hours where you really need it is very expensive, and that gets passed on to the consumers.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I guess the kind of compounding problem here, right, is population moving around, right? Because if you look at Texas 10 years ago or 15 years ago, just in general, the load was probably less because per cap you just didn't have that many people there. I mean,
Yeah.
quite honestly, right? And so you make a state that is lucrative in terms of, whatever reasons to move there, whether it be taxes or Californians moving over there or whatever that might be, your overall net load is just necessarily going to be higher.
And it is growing there, right? Yeah, because a lot of people are moving. It's one of that in Florida, right? The two biggest states for net income. And we're seeing people move to Arizona as well, right? They
Mhm.
call the sun states that seem to be attracting a lot of it. And it could be based because people like the weather or, also policy based. It's
Yeah.
maybe more business friendly. That seems to be where the jobs are going.
Yeah, entirely. And you touched on this really interesting point around policy before. I know before we started hitting record, you also kind of mentioned that you're working on some things around policy as well. You raise a really interesting point, and this kind of ties into water a little bit of how energy generation is actually labeled, right? You had mentioned in California or Colorado, there's some distinctions on whether this falls into the energy side of things or the kind of oil and gas side of things. Can you walk us through that distinction? Like what exactly does all that mean and how does policy fit in with the diversification of using, intermittent versus baseline energy
Oh
generation
yeah.
technologies?
That excellent question. Yeah, we before this podcast began, Ravi and I were talking about this recent project I was working on geothermal energy, and one thing I love about geothermal energy is that it is a base load energy source, meaning it could run all the time. We It's not subject to intermittency. But what's interesting is you look at the historical nature, and this is like a nice fun fact I always throw out there is like The companies that started geothermal energy back in the late 50s, early 60s, and it started in California, they were the oil and gas companies.
Mm.
It was actually Union Oil Company of California. Why? Because it's the drilling technology, right? That's what you need. And when you think about geothermal, I mean, it's expensive. To drill a hole now is 15 to 20 million dollars. So if you don't hit that well right to get that hot geothermal water, the resource we call it, you got to drill another one. That's another 40 million. Now you're up to 60 to do three, right? So the cost can really go up unless you get this right when you begin to drill. So anyway, but one of the issues what made California such a star in geothermal energy is from the beginning, they defined it in the books as energy. Like, it's like, well, what is geothermal? We've never heard of it. Well, let's just define it as energy. And when they defined it as energy, it fell under the oil and gas law, which the nice thing about that is in the state of California, oil and gas is just like a property right, right? You could sell the rights to the oil under the ground, just like you could the mineral rights anywhere else. So it became a nice transactive marketplace with geothermal. Now, let's contrast that with the state of Colorado. Colorado, like California, has prior appropriation laws. This is the idea, which you've probably spoken about already, I'm sure, in your podcast, Robbie. But for those who haven't, I'll give you a refresher for those that are listening to this podcast. So there are two types of water laws that we have, and they kind of go on a range here in the United States. We have riparian, which is essentially the idea that if the stream runs through your property, riparian means like the bank, essentially in Latin, then you can have right to actually take the water from that stream that runs through your property because, well, it's your property and the water's running through it. And in the East, and this is like basically a law that came from England, right? And we use it here for many of the Eastern states have adopted this because there's a lot of water. When you come back to the West, and when they were beginning to settle the West, right? Water's scarce. We're in a desert, right? It's in the desert everywhere from this side of the Rocky Mountains. And so you had miners and you had farmers settling. These were the two major groups. And what did they have to do? Well, they had to set up water irrigation projects to get the water either to the mines to do the sluicing or get the water to the farms. But they had, again, how are you going to like manage these rights? So they came up with this idea called prior appropriation, which was first come, first in right. The idea is that if you were the first person to take that water, make an investment and divert that water to say your mine to do the sluicing, or take that water to your field, then you get the first rights to how much water you're using for that beneficial use. And then anybody else comes in, they could take it too if there's still left over, and such and such and such all the way down to the bottom, right? And so if there's like a drought that year, those at the bottom, they lose their water, right? And so the rights progressively go up to the first person who had the water rights. And that's just how things were done in the West. So California uses prior appropriation, a little bit of riparian. It's not as strict as Colorado, but Colorado's so strict that you don't own the rain when it falls and hits your roof. You're not allowed to, like here in California, I've got barrels collecting my water from my rain gutters. You can't do that in Colorado. That water is owned by the state and by those prior appropriators who have it. So it's very strict. And the thing about this is that one of the problems is that Colorado legislature, when all the states back in the 70s, basically early 80s, they're all like, oh yeah, this is during the energy crisis. We're like, well, we should define, these new technologies. We see California's got geothermal. There's potential here. Let's define it too. They defined it as water. And this, though, is problematic because what we find in our research is that by them defining it as water, it put geothermal in conflict with their very stringent water law. And even though Colorado has what I would argue, the largest amount of economically extractable geothermal resource, meaning they could be producing a ton of geothermal power, right? It's the potential regulatory costs of getting through like these hurdles of the water law. They don't have one. They don't have one geothermal plant in the state of Colorado. Here we are in the year 2023.
Wow, that is super, super interesting. So just to kind of unpack that a little bit, right? You have the riparian sort of way of looking at water rights, and then you have this prior appropriation. California looks at the geothermal and basically labels it as oil and gas. And actually, one thing I wanted to kind of double click into is in California regulating it as oil and gas, and it being, you had mentioned property, right? It's kind of a way to look at how you would have property. How I understand thematically how that's different than what Colorado is doing, but what does that inherently do? Like that obviously will increase the amount of geothermal plants that you have out there. And when you don't have this sort of prior appropriation methodology, how does that change? Like what distinction does that make having it be a property versus
Yeah.
the opposite?
Yeah, so prior, so let's think about this. Like the fact that it is labeled like a royalty, like a mineral right. That's how we got to think about it. Geothermal is like a mineral right in the state of California, and mineral rights can be traded, right? Someone owned the land at one point, maybe they severed the mineral right from the land surface, and then they sell that right to somebody else, and then
Mhm.
they've got the mineral right, and then they could sell it to somebody else, right? And so it can just go into a marketplace, right? That's the nice thing about it. The problem with prior appropriation is that there is already inherent bias and that there's a limited amount of that water. And so let's say someone who's like a really high prior appropriator, they have that water right. Okay. In state of California, this is, there are these prior appropriation federal water rights and they got state prior appropriation rights prior to say like 1880
Mhm.
before the state decided to regulate and say, all right, we're going to do it differently from those after 1880. Well, those are that are grandfathered in. They're never going to give up those water rights because they're actually tied to the investments made to where that water's going.
Wait, so you're saying 1880? Didn't California get its independent? Like it joined the union in 1850 or
Yes,
so?
but in the eight, and then I got to get the right year, and I'm sorry, it's somewhere in the 1880s or like
Yeah.
1890, right around there. The state decided to regulate. So late, it's the late 19th century. They decided to regulate water differently than what they had done prior.
Okay.
Okay. So then they start giving out water rights, but the water rights weren't necessarily tied to the prior appropriation regime that existed before.
Sure.
And it allowed the state to actually restrict them a bit more when there was a drought, all of them.
Got
Okay.
it. Got it. Got it. Okay.
And it allows a little bit more for this changing of the water rights beyond just being stuck to the beneficial use of the investments where the water's going. So you have a pipeline that takes it to this spot, and well, whoever has that spot has that pipeline. That's essentially tied to that prior appropriation water right that they have, right?
Sure.
So that's that's how it was, back then. And it makes these essentially makes like those rights very sticky, right? Nobody really wants to give those up because, and if they did, like they're going to pay a load of money for it because you've got senior rights. No one's taking that away from you.
Mhm.
Now, let's say if geothermal was classified as water, that means I'm coming in now in the year, I don't know, 2023, and I want to come in, I want to drill, right? Water is the medium by which I take that heat out of the earth, right?
Yeah.
To run my turbines. I am at the bottom of the prior appropriation chain. And if someone above feels like that might infringe on their water rights by somehow taking it away, like, oh no, if you do this, this might dry down the water table, this might affect me and my ability, et cetera, right? Though it probably wouldn't, but let's just say if it could, the
Sure.
legal regulatory costs would be very high because they'd be going to court. So that's what prohibits this so much, say in Colorado, is that these people who have the prior appropriation water claims, they can take them to court and argue that any driller coming in and getting like a lower water right to do
Yeah.
this geothermal, right, that they could be infringing upon their rights.
Got it. Got
Right.
it.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes complete sense. And so if we double click into actually water being used in California, right? The geothermal obviously, as you mentioned, is listed as this kind of ownership standpoint. Is agriculture still under prior appropriation? You are our largest user of water. How
Yes,
is
they
that
are.
was that politically
Yes, all
regulated?
agriculture and their water rights are based on, like, again, the most of them are type of prior appropriation falling under early 19th century state water law, late 19th century state water to the present, as well as a federal water law that was set up in the 1910s, 1920s, 30s, during the water reclamation, where they built canals, federal water canals, and essentially gave water rights to some of the farmers at that time. So we've got this whole myriad of different water rights. There was a podcast I was on with an environmental law professor from USC, and I welcome everyone to listen to that because she goes deep into the different types of the water laws as we were debating about what businesses are doing. And I was suggesting, like, every farmer I spoke to says they just want to be able to sell and put these water rights on a marketplace, but we can't do it. And she just went through all the major facts of like, this is why.
Interesting.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'd love to grab that podcast. I can throw it on the
Yeah.
YouTube channel or the Spotify after. Actually, that'd be great. Really cool. And so, first of all, it's actually really interesting that we have 130, 150-year-old water laws that were made back in the 1800s, early 1900s, that are still regulating a very different world that we have today. And it's actually really interesting that we did kind of separate out geothermal to be this more on this more ownership model.
Yeah,
Um,
like a mineral right. I think that's the best way to say it.
a
It's
mineral right,
essentially a
yeah.
mineral right. Yeah.
Is there any complexity between it, like it, especially in California, around geothermal being a mineral right? I mean, does it have any sort of implications around the prior appropriation side? Like, if I'm drilling in the middle of the Central Valley for geothermal, will a farmer come to me and say, "Hey, wait up a second, buddy. Like, this is my groundwater. You're
There's always that potential, right? But they're on much better standing because if they own those mineral rights, meaning the heat,
Mhm.
right? And they can go in and do this and they'll have to follow. It depends again. So most geothermals, they actually recharge their reservoir, right? By running the hot water up, it spins the turbines, and then they take that hot water and inject it back in the ground. So it has to pass section 403 of the Clean Water Act because there is essentially a recharge back into the ground. But that's pretty easy for the EPA. They're pretty positive in doing this. And once they say it's positive from the EPA, it's kind of difficult from the farmers to go in and to argue that, given that it's a mineral right and not water. And then the burden's on them now, the farmers, not on the geothermal company, to prove that it's having that effect. Whereas the opposite's true. If it were water, it'd be the burden on the geothermal companies to prove that it didn't. Yeah.
yeah, it makes sense. And I guess if you're recharging the water, I guess the thesis is that whatever you started off with is what you're ending up with at the end of the day, anyways. For the audience that is a little bit unfamiliar of geothermal, I know we've been talking about geothermal. Can you kind of just go back to the basics and explain what is geothermal, how it works,
Oh yeah.
what's the energy source?
Yeah, so essentially how this works is that there's these hot rocks and that are, I mean, look, you go further down, you're going to hit the mantle, right? It's very hot, right? But in certain parts of the crust, it's very hot, right? That hot rock mantle kind of comes up closer. I mean, think about it. We're near volcanoes, so it makes sense. If we go to the geysers region of Northern California, near
Hmm.
Mount Shasta and all the other volcanoes, right? Then this is why, right? You go to Hawaii on the Big Island, they have geothermal projects there, the Puna Station, right? Basically collecting their heat from the volcano that's so close, right? The mantle that's so close. And so the idea then is like you've got this heat. Well, then what can we do? So generally, there's water always in the earth. And like if we go to the first time where they develop it was at the place called the geysers because they are geysers, right? Similar to Yellowstone. Water gets into that hot rock, it boils, it shoots off a steam, right? It goes up into the air. And the idea was, oh, well, this is kind of cool. Maybe we could somehow take that steam energy, right? Kind of like early,
Like early
17th,
steam train.
18th century, yeah, 18th century James Watt technology, right? Let's
Yeah,
take
yeah.
the steam and see if we can, create this mechanical and electrical energy from it. And that's what they did. So the early technology essentially was having the oil companies come in, drill down to where there was enough pressure underground, because there's always pressure underground. And then as that water generally comes up, it's either in a steam, but it's usually in a hot water form. But because it's under pressure, it's liquid. And as it comes up, it turns into a steam because it's becoming less pressurized, and that turns a turbine. Then they'll condense it and throw it back into the ground. That's the earlier technologies. Now, the latest technologies is called binary. So we don't need water that's actually above boiling point anymore. We could take water that's, say, I'm going to use Fahrenheit. Let's use Celsius here. So let's say like 90 degrees Celsius or even 80 degrees Celsius. And we could take that and we run it in a heat exchanger with a liquid that has a lower boiling point. And then that liquid with the lower boiling point turns the turbine in a closed loop fashion. And then we just take that hot water and it gets injected back in the ground. So we're just pumping out hot water and it
Yeah.
runs a heat exchanger. And that's called the binary cycle technology. And we've been using that now for the last 20 years.
Really cool. And so in that binary technology, there's no water that's even coming out of the ground. I mean, that's all just
Oh, no,
actually
no, it is. Yeah, we
being
are pumping that hot water out of
hot
the
water up.
ground
Okay.
and then we pump it back down, right? And then it as it goes through this heat exchanger, there's another fluid,
Yep.
right? That turns into a gas, turns a turbine, then it recondenses in a closed loop fashion.
Similar to like a heat pump.
That's right.
Yep.
Just like a heat pump.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah. So this
Um,
is and what the nice thing about this binary is it makes geothermal essentially relevant in many parts of the United States, because we don't have to just look for water that can turn into steam anymore. We just have to look for hot water, and that's pretty abundant everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And so let's go back to this kind of Utah reliability affordability standpoint and take that lens and put it back on binary geothermal. Are we approaching close to what would be parity of, hydrocarbon based energy, or getting close to it? Are we still kind of way far off? Where do we stand from like a cost perspective outside of the $15 million to actually dig holes in the ground?
Yeah. So geothermal isn't cheap, and that is true, right? And so but they could run a good 30, 40 years, right? Now, Utah does have geothermal plants. Mind you, they do have quite a few in like the middle section. And then again, it's just this idea of balancing that portfolio. So utilities will come in and they'll buy it and they'll say, look, we want some geothermal. We want to lower our carbon emissions. We'll buy geothermal energy. We'll buy maybe some wind, some solar, but we're not going to go over in any one of these, right? Just because we want to keep the affordability and the reliability high. And I think that's an important aspect, is balancing that portfolio. Because, well, there's a lot of issues why, but one is, let's look at Germany. Okay. Article I read today, I think it was actually in Die Welt, which was one of the newspapers there, but one of the CEOs of a company said, we're not going to invest in Germany anymore. They're a German company. And in fact, he made this thing. It's like, we're in an energy crisis. We've shut down our nuclear. We don't have any more Russian gas. And you expect us to do this all with like wind, right? We don't have enough. And it's like, we're not making any more investments. And he said in his thing that I'm really worried that we're going to begin to see the deindustrialization of Germany because they don't have that reliable, affordable energy anymore.
Yeah.
Energy is the key to everything. If we don't have affordable, reliable energy, we will industrialize. I mean, it's what we're seeing in Germany is likely what's going to be happening in other parts of the United States. Now, again, we don't do as much manufacturing as Germany, as much as we hope so, right? But with the trade wars and deglobalization, I mean, that could come back, but it won't come back to states where they have unreliable and very high energy costs.
Of course. Yeah. Makes complete sense. I want to take kind of a quick step back because I know we've been talking a lot about geothermal, but you work on a bunch of stuff at USC. We were talking before the call. You're in agribusiness. We were also talking about lithium mines. What is kind of your worldview of what you're looking at USC and what you're kind of working on? I'd love to like pick a
Oh,
few
yeah.
of
Thank
those.
you. Yeah. So here's the great news, that we just got a couple donors have decided to invest here in USC into an energy innovation initiative that we have. So we're going to be starting that up this year. And the idea is like fall 2024, we want to have an energy week. We're going to have an energy conference open to everybody. Practitioners is what we want, where we could bring in who are the latest people doing both the business side, the entrepreneurs, right? Maybe they got a hydrogen and a technology they're trying to sell, right? Have them come in, bring their pitches. We want to hear, and then we're going to bring in the real scientists doing the work in the background and tell us what they think about it. I was just speaking with some USC scientists at the Locher Institute, where we've had some Nobel winners. It's the Hydrocarbon Institute, and they're doing like the cutting edge research on hydrogen. And one of the things that they told me, which is that, hydrogen, smallest molecule in the world, right? You can't put it through a steel pipe. Because two reasons: it leaches through the steel
Way.
because it's so small, and two, it makes it brittle in the process. So you lose like structural integrity. So the fact that, I've heard a lot of these companies, and some of them I've actually worked with, like gas companies, that say, hey, we're going to go 100% hydrogen. No, with your existing infrastructure. Like, it's not, there's going to have to be some major upgrades in how we think about this. I mean, right now we only know of ceramics and some carbon fibers that can actually contain hydrogen gas. So these are the types of things we need to think about. And the idea is we're going to get together, who are the people doing the cutting edge of this energy innovation, both from the business, the entrepreneur side, and the scientists. Bring them in, let's talk about it. Let's hear the panels, and it'll be a nice networking event too. So we're shooting for the fall of 2024.
Okay. That's such a beautiful vision for an event, right? Let's throw scientists and the entrepreneurs both together in a room and talk about the hard problems that we need to solve. That's awesome.
Because the entrepreneur is always going to be like it's going to be positive, flowers.
Yeah. And you've also done some work with entrepreneurs as well. What can you talk a little bit more about that?
Oh, entrepreneurs themselves?
Yeah,
Yeah. So
you mentioned.
see, a lot of my research is like looking at the entrepreneur. So even from an energy or agribusiness, I'm looking at the companies and the entrepreneurs and what decides, At what point do they believe that there's an opportunity enough that it warrants their investment and they make that decision? So I look a lot at like startup, right? That's the thing I'm very interested in is what leads to the startup. I do have some entrepreneurial performance aspects as well over time, mainly looking at sort of like policy aspects that might drive it. But this opportunity aspect is just fascinating. A couple aspects that I've found is that, you know, opportunity is now can be affected by just what stakeholders are saying out in the environment. I have a couple papers, one looking at like the wood pellet industry in the United States.
Mm,
Probably not
okay.
many people probably know about this. And biodiesel, looking at the emergence of that market too. But what I found empirically was that in every one of these cases, these entrepreneurs were jumping in and they're deciding their technology choice and where they're going to operate by also taking a pulse of the environment and like what the potential, if we call them stakeholders, would say. These wouldn't necessarily be their customers, but these are just the people out there, right, who may be for or completely against this type of business activity or technology use. And which was kind of a cool paper to see that these entrepreneurs, I mean, before it was always about the common consensus was no, entrepreneurs are completely driven by potential profit, right? This is the Schumpeterian notion. And it's true, that is a major aspect. But how do they make those strategic choices? And we find like they go beyond just looking at the potential profit margin and or return on investment, but they're also looking at, all right, what are the potential risks or opportunities that can come through what these people out in the environment, these stakeholders are saying, right? This community organization or these social activists. So
Sure. And if you kind of double click into that in the view of water, and you take this non-Schumpeterian point of view of entrepreneurs looking at opportunity of what the other stakeholders are doing, what if you're going to look forward to the next 5, 7, 10 years, looking at the stakeholders on one hand, and then kind of the technologies that are out there, where should an entrepreneur that's like listening to this podcast that's coming up with the next idea, what should they be focusing on? Like, what are you seeing?
yeah.
I know this is a little bit
Yeah,
broad,
no,
but like,
it's good.
yeah.
One thing I've been quite positive on, well, two actually aspects on this water at the nexus of this is this idea of pumped storage for energy. So we talked about this about if we're going to move more to these intermittent renewables, because the federal policy is giving the money out, and so people are investing in it, and some states like California are pushing towards it. Well, what are we going to do to have those electrons when we need it at a low cost? And pump storage is actually a very good way of doing this. The idea is that you have a reservoir that's higher than another. And when you have the surplus electrons, you pump water up. So it becomes
Mm,
essentially like a battery. And then when you need it, the water's drawn down, spins another turbine, and generates that energy that you need. And what we're finding is like it's an old technology. It's been around over 150 years. It's hydropower, but entrepreneurs are getting really creative at this. There is this one company, say, in I believe it's in the state of Tennessee, Kentucky, around that area, or is it? I wish I had the name of it right now. But essentially, they've taken an old coal mine, and in this coal mine, they had like some big open pits up on a mountain, and they got those shafts underground, like another big pit down in a lower valley. And essentially, they're using like this huge open pit at the top of a mountain as a reservoir, and they're running the pipes through the shafts, the old mine shafts, to fill up this lower reservoir. And this is going to produce up to 400 megawatts of energy daily
wow.
through pump storage. So that is a really cool reuse of an old, no longer using this coal mine, but now they've reused it into essentially a hydropower battery. Right. So I'm very positive. I'm still bullish about the potential for hydropower in the United States. The second one, which is quite interesting at this nexus of energy and water, is the use of geothermal brine to extract lithium. So
Okay.
this first was discovered about 7 years ago in the Salton Sea area. There's a startup right now working with the existing geothermal operator. And so what they're doing is as this brine comes up, this hot water to run the geothermal, they're taking it, they're going to divert it, and they're going to extract some of this lithium ions because lithium is essentially just a salt. So they're going to extract the salt from it, and then the water just goes back into the geothermal well, and hopefully after a while they're going to extract enough of this that they'll be able to have enough lithium that they could sell. So that's really cool. They're just basically there's already existing infrastructure and they're just kind of building on it. Now,
Yeah.
with the Inflation Reduction Act, that kind of incentivizes this idea of making all the battery components within the United States, the supply chain, right? We're seeing now large investments from oil and gas companies that have the drilling technology, and they're jumping into this, not necessarily with geothermal, but just for the mere fact to extract these brines from the ground. And when I say brines, it's a salt water, right? That's where you're going to
Hmm.
find lithium. And so, for example, ExxonMobil has purchased the rights of 10,000 acres in Arkansas, right? To where they're going to be sucking up this salt water and extracting that lithium. Now, there could be potential problems with this, right? And that we haven't foreseen. And this is where I think that, it's a cool entrepreneurial opportunity, but we want to make sure that, the water's gone recharged back in there without causing too many problems. So I think there's going to be a lot of research on this, and just to make sure, I think oversight, definitely. I think the EPA will be involved on this
Sure.
because once you get the lithium out, you got to do like this lime, this hydro, oh gosh, what is it called? This acid sometimes it's needed to refine it once you actually extract it out of the brines in the water.
Hmm.
So all of this means is that there could be some potential for environmental issues. But on the flip side, I believe that using this like water may be one of the lower cost and least environmental invasive than what we're currently doing. Right now, lithium is being extracted mainly from brines in, say, like Chile and Argentina, but it's very water intensive. They're essentially pulling the water out in the desert and just putting it in these ponds, these tailing ponds, and letting it evaporate. What this
Ah,
is a problem that they're losing that water.
yep.
Right? Because that's they get it. They just let it evaporate, and this is what they're doing right now in northern Argentina and in northern Chile. This is the traditional way of doing lithium now. The idea, though, with this, the technology I talked before, is that water can be reinjected back into the reservoirs, right? Much more sustainable, given the fact that, as we know, like water's becoming a scarce commodity. We've taken it for granted for so long, and with different changing weather patterns and aspects, right? That it's just becoming more scarce. So we need to
Yeah.
treat it as a scarce item and price it accordingly.
Entirely, yeah, and I love those. I love those two technologies, especially the using the potential energy and creating basically a hydropower battery. That's super cool too, especially using existing infrastructure, right? Like you said, they use that mining, the old mining plant that they had. That's super cool.
Yeah, an old
That's
coal
awesome.
mine.
Yeah. Let's take a quick left turn. I always like to ask this question, understand from our guests. What was your through line? Like, how did you get to becoming Professor Shon Hiatt? Where did you grow up? What's your
Oh
background?
yeah. So I grew up in Idaho, actually, rural Idaho. I worked on our family dairy farm. And during the summer or months harvest, I always worked for my friends who were wheat farmers. And I
Mm,
envied them because I was like, you guys only work twice a year, planting and harvesting, right? That's what you want to. You want to be a wheat farmer. But anyway, the nice thing about also though being in Idaho is that we have a plethora of like hydropower because it's natural. We have the Rocky Mountains that collect the water, and we have rivers where we use that. In fact, my little town actually has its own dam that was built in 1910 that
mm,
provides still one third of the power today, right? Churning out a full 7 cents a kilowatt hour for that's the charge. I mean, it's super cheap, the electricity there,
wow.
and renewable, right? So it's a great place. So my interest in like agribusiness energy kind of came from like my background, growing up in Idaho.
Awesome. And what was your kind of train after the dairy farming and wheat farming stint? Did you go to the college at USC as well? What did that kind of
Oh yeah, so no,
trajectory look?
then I went to undergraduate at Brigham Young University in Utah,
Okay.
and I started working for a professor who was a business professor. I was just an RA. And I was quite interested in, entrepreneurship because, well, fast forward. So during that time, as an undergraduate, I took a 2-year hiatus and went down to Chile as a service missionary. And there I saw, the aspects, in every emerging economy, there's like the struggles, the economic struggles. You were talking about this earlier with me, Robbie, like this idea of economic development and
Mhm.
helping to bring people out of poverty. And I just saw like, those that were entrepreneurs and were able to grasp an idea, those are the ones that pulled themselves out. And so I got interested in this and I found a professor at BYU when I was back doing research on microfinance and investments, giving capital essentially to these entrepreneurs. I was like, this is really neat. And then, I went to this conference. This is kind of fun. I went to this conference in New York City, this microfinance conference, and really cool, great speakers were there. And I ended up in this lobby talking to this professor who was a professor at the Kennedy School of Government from Harvard. And he said, I was just like you at one point. I wanted to change the world, but I knew I couldn't do it without a PhD. So I was like, got to get a PhD, right? So that led me go to Cornell, did a master's PhD there. My first job was at Harvard Business School, where I taught in their agribusiness and energy global seminars. It's their executive education programs. And then, I ended up marrying as an undergrad a woman from California. And so when USC came knocking, my wife said, "You're going."
Wow, that is awesome. From your you looking at it today with being an agribusiness focusing on energy. I mean, just that through line of doing the missionary project in Chile, studying entrepreneurship, and then being at the dairy farm. Like the whole thing ties together so nicely. It's a little bow. It's so cool.
Our lives like would just kind of take us on these paths, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah, entirely. Funny you say microfinance. I was actually working with Grameen in India when
oh
I was
yes.
there. And yeah, very similar infrastructural technology that we were using in terms of like M-Pesa and getting these kind of microfinance and the ability for people to actually send small sums of money to each other, and then also us make smaller investments into the companies that we were working on. But entirely, I haven't heard the words microfinance in a while though. So
Mhm.
really cool. We're coming close to time here. I have kind of one question that I love to get from everybody. Is there a book or a movie or like a TV show that has changed your outlook on life and particularly around water agribusiness? Anything that the audience can pick up?
I do. I actually got to look this up if you don't mind. Uh,
Yeah, sure, go for it.
what is it called? There it is. All right. So there is a physicist named Stephen Koonin, right? He's at NYU. He was also a professor at MIT. He served in the Obama administration, and his book called Unsettled is an excellent read for anybody interested in like what is climate change and what does it mean. And essentially, as a physicist, he goes through and he pulls apart these models saying we really know very little about this. And yes, the Earth's been changing climate for 4.5 billion years. It's existed for 4.5 billion years. But the fact that I just definitely read it, right? Because he I mean, this again, he's part of the Obama administration. He understands the issue, but
Sure.
he's basically pulls apart these current models that we have and say, like, these all things need to be thrown out. We need to start from scratch again. So I think it's worth the read for anybody who wants to understand a little bit about, what is it? Why did they say 1.5 degrees Celsius? Is that even true? Right. And how do they come up with that 1.5? Is that precise? And so anyway, excellent book to read. It'll actually make you stand back and think and say, "Huh, okay, we should
Yeah,
think about,
awesome.
our policies maybe a little differently." So,
Sure. And I think, back to the entrepreneurs in the audience and anybody that's looking out there to kind of enter this technology, it's always good to go back to first principles. It's always good to look at the assumptions that we're initially making because that helps us track what we're going to do next. And if the initial underlying assumptions, I wouldn't say if they're flawed or not flawed, but it's probably good to understand where we're coming from. And
that's
that's
right.
awesome. That's an awesome reference. So Stephen Kunin, the book is Unsettled.
Yes.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's all that we have time for today. Thank you all for listening to Liquid Assets. You can find us wherever you download your podcast, be that on Spotify, Apple, Google. Today we had Professor Shon Hiatt at the USC Marshall School of Business. Sean, thanks a ton for coming with us today. This was an awesome discussion.